So basically how I'd like to start is give a brief and basic explanation of gsoap and the protocol which it implements soap. And then I also have a small demo application to show you how to take an existing C or C++ application that has no GUI functionality built into it, just command line usage only. And I'd like to show you how to use gsoap to add a small and simple web-based GUI to that pre-existing application. So to really understand what gsoap is and what it can do for you, you kind of need to know what SOAP or the SOAP protocol is and what its capabilities are. So really gsoap is just a software development kit for C and C++ applications. And what it does is it adds SOAP protocol capability to those applications. A neat fact about it is that Robert Van Engelen, who is the Florida State University Computer Science Department chair right now, actually he's the one who developed this system of gsoap. Another neat fact is that it's used by some of the largest companies in the world, and I think that, at least personally, I think that speaks to the utility of it. So what SOAP is, in a basic sense, is it will allow you to use remote procedure calls in your application. So for example, you have an application running on a computer in Texas and you have a server running on a computer in New York City, for example. Now, through the use of remote procedure calls, or RPCs, these two applications in different locations can execute, well, the client can execute functions on the server in the other location via network connection. So what enables you to have a client that can execute a method on a remote server is, and also in that sense pass data between the two, is the XML serialization of that data. So for example, you're not limited to passing primitive types only to the server and back. You can also pass object data back and forth. Now, one thing you also need to be aware of is that SOAP is a standard technology. That means that there are libraries for it already, for Java and .NET, Ruby, Perl, C, and C++. Now, gsoap is solely for C and C++. So the nice thing about gsoap is it allows you to do all of the RPCs and the data structure serialization without having to write your own, daemon or service. And what I mean by that is you don't have to worry about dealing with TCP sockets and figuring out how to, format all your objects in a transportable way. So a couple of things I'd like to touch on that you need to be aware of if you decide to give gsoap a whirl is you need to understand that the ns character or string inside of this comment here, this comment right here where it says gsoap space ns space service. Now that ns between gsoap and service is where you declare, this is the line where you declare what your namespace is going to be for these functions that follow. So for example, I'm using the namespace urn:calculator, which maps to these functions. And you also need to know that the ns string right here is what is the one that prefixes those functions. So for example, since I just have ns, I need to have ns underscore underscore and then my function name or my function prototype. So if this was, and this could be any string, it could be ns1, it could be ns2, ns whatever, but whatever that is, that needs to come before these double underscores. and what that does is it maps the XML namespace to the function. So in essence, you can have different XML namespaces for different classes of function. What I'm going to do in my example is I'm going to take an existing C++ application that has no GUI interface, so it's just command line only. And I'm going to add a web-based GUI to it. So the provider, the data provider, is just an embedded computer that is running the C++ application. And then the GUI provider is just a Ruby on Rails application that it's basically a web server, and your web browser, whether it's Firefox or Chrome or Internet Explorer, is accessing that GUI provider. So a little bit about the environment here is the embedded computer has an FPGA plugged into the PCIe slot, and that FPGA is programmed for testing proprietary hardware. Now the C++ application actually interacts with that FPGA via a C library that was written in-house, and the C library accesses the FPGA via a Linux kernel module that was also written in-house. So you can kind of see the layers here, and you can kind of envision the amount of effort it would take to extend that C++ app with like a Qt GUI, for example, or if you were to somehow, since it's already built into Linux, using a Linux system, how you can imagine how hard it would be to port that to a Windows system. Now, the nice thing about extending it via web system is that web system could, or this Ruby on Rails application could actually be running on a totally different server. It could be on Windows, it could be on Linux, it could be on Mac. It doesn't matter, because SOAP is allowing it to communicate, that web GUI to communicate with this embedded computer via network. So it's kind of like a cross-platform compatibility layer at the same time as adding, this GUI. It's really nice and a handy thing to be able to do. So this is kind of a high-level overview of how we're going to do this. So these are the functions that I have in my legacy application. Super simple. And this is the function that I want to make available via SOAP. I don't want to make set firmware version available via the GUI. I don't think that would be very desirable. But basically, so I only want get firmware version to be available. So, and that is done via a header file that you write. So you write a header file, and the header file basically declares what functions are going to be available via SOAP. So I'm just going to write in get firmware version. I am not going to write anything about set firmware version. So on to showing you that code. This is a legacy application. Inside of it, I've just declared a constant stead string firmware version, and I've also declared a function that just returns a reference to this string. So basically, I want the SOAP method to basically wrap this function. So when that SOAP method is called, I want it to call this pre-built legacy functions. Now this is really simple. You say, well, why don't you just return, this string from the SOAP method? Well, I'm trying to show you how, like, you might have a method that is way more complicated than this. It's doing a lot of stuff. So rather than rewriting all of that, just wrap that pre-existing method with your SOAP method. So keeping that in mind, I have in my header file, my SOAP server header file, I have declared this function called get firmware version. Now this function is what's going to be available from the SOAP server. And as you see here, all of the this is a good thing for you to know. Any function that you declare in your SOAP server header file has to have the return type of int, because that is how the SOAP server determines whether or not there was an error. So over here in the implementation file of this header file, I have my function. A special thing you have to do is you have to include a soap pointer struct in here. So you can just kind of ignore that for now. I don't really want to go into that detail. But basically, I've also have my my result here that I want to return this to. So basically, when a client of this soap server calls get firmware version, this function is invoked. It calls get firmware version from my legacy application, which then returns the reference to this string, and that string contains this value 1023. So let me show you how that works here. I've already compiled this code, this server code, so that I'll spare you guys from that time, because I do have some time constraints here. So I'm going to run it. I've started my SOAP server. Now I'm going to start my what's called a Rails server, which is just a simple development web server that you can use when you're working in Ruby on Rails. So I'm going to start that. That's started up. It's told me that it is running on port 3000 here. And just note that when I started my SOAP server, I gave it the argument of 10,000, which just means that I want it to start on port 10,000. So in here, I can go to my firmware page, and it is returning that string. So that is a quick overview of how you can use gsoap to extend an existing application, such as this one here on the right of my screen. So a very basic example, but just a quick intro on how you can do it and how you can utilize the power of gsoap. I hope you found this presentation interesting. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave those below this YouTube video, and best of luck.